right, you guys ready to dance? That gets you in the mood, do the little shoulders thing, right? You're going, all right. Well, good morning. It is good to see you this morning, and I am excited to be a part of being able to help us finish this series as we finish the story of David. And when we do that, when I've been working on that this week, if I was in one sentence to kind of sum up where I feel like David finds himself at this spot where we're going to pick up the story, is he's asking the question, how did I get here? You may be able to relate. There may be a time in your life when you have asked the question, how did I get here? And as I was thinking about that, I thought of a story about a time in my life when I asked that question. And to really understand the gravity of that story, you need to know that since I was little, I loved to drive. I always wanted to drive. And probably part of that cultivated that in me is my grandpa my grandma and grandpa lived on about a couple acres of land, and they had a riding lawnmower. And I thought that was awesome. I loved that riding lawnmower. When I would get to my grandparents' house, one of the first things I wanted to do was get myself on that lawnmower. And I would ride and ride and ride. And my grandpa, because he was such a good man to me, he would put it in the high gear so that you could go. Not just mowing speed, but higher than mowing speed. And I would drive. And when I was young, I loved it so much. And I had quite the imagination. I decided that I was a bus driver. And I would use that lawnmower, and I would drive, and there were different natural breaks in his yard, right? So I would drive to it, and I would stop, and I'd put down the mower and pretend like I was letting the kids come up on the bus. Yes, that was me. And then I'd move it back, right, and I'd drive some more, and I had a route. I had developed a route, and there was a routine. And I would do it when I stayed there. I would do it mid-morning, and then I would do it in the afternoon, because that's what a good bus driver does, right? You pick up and take home the kids. And I did it. I love to drive. My brothers quite didn't get it. Maybe they made fun of me, but I didn't care because my love for driving overrode all of that, right? So you can imagine when it was time for me to get my license, I was ready. Right? It was time. I did all things I had to do in Indiana. I grew up in Indiana. If you took driver's ed, you got your license early. So I made sure I had taken care of that. I was ready. The day I got my license, I grew up in a small town, Indiana. The day I got it, I went to the city with my friends, and we had fun. We went out to dinner. It was great. I thought I was living the life, driving myself and my friends. And what we also like to do, and if you're older, you may relate to this, but we like to cruise. Does anyone remember cruising? And what that really meant is you just drove around, right, in your car with your friends, and you would just drive. And sometimes we'd call it dragging the main, because there was a road where you would go, and you would see other people driving, and you kind of made this circle. So it was a social event, this cruising thing. And one night I was with my friend. We were cruising and talking and cruising and talking. And sometimes when I get to talk, I'm not always paying real good attention. So I find myself, I grew up in small town Indiana, and outside is the country of the town. And so we were driving, and all of a sudden it occurs to me that what I see on the right of me and what I see on the left of me is cornfields. And I have no idea where we are. We're in the country somewhere, right? And this is before GPSs, right? Couldn't just pull out my phone. I couldn't call anyone. So we're driving, and in the beginning, you're trying to convince yourself you got this handled, right? So me and my friend, I was like, we got this. We're totally going to find our way. This is going to be good, right? An adventure, try to make it fun. And then as it went on, we became a little more panicked because, we can't figure out where to go. And, you would get to a spot, and you're like, should we go right? Should we go left? I don't know. But we would try to think about where we thought we were to where we were trying to go closer to the town. But one of the questions I would ask is, how did we get here? Because if we could backtrack, we might be able to find where we're supposed to go. So I kept saying that, and we totally didn't know where we were supposed to go. So I started to think, well, surely they'll come find us, right? If we never come home, will people come looking for us? But when you're cruising, you don't really tell, you kind of spur of the moment, you don't know where you're going. So, they wouldn't know where to come find us. So I'm like, okay. And then I started thinking, how much gas do I have in the tank? Because, sometimes you'd let that go a little bit. And so then I was like, can we sleep here overnight? Like, now I'm trying to decide. I don't know how long it was, but it felt like hours. But eventually, we took enough rights, lefts. I don't know. We found a street that, in street I would mean gravel road. We found a gravel road in which seemed familiar, and we got back to our town. And it was this like, right, like I am here. And we were so excited. But I remember through that process asking oftentimes, how did we get here? Right? So then I can know how to backtrack and get where I want to go. And as we pick up David's story today, as we're towards the end of his life, I think he's asking that same question. But before we do that, let's do a little recap. So we know the story of David started with him being a shepherd boy. Samuel came to his household because he was going to anoint the next king of Israel. They brought all the brothers in. Joseph was still out, right? And Samuel says, none of these are the person. Do you have another brother? And they're like, yeah, David, right? Like he's out, shepherd boy. So they bring him in. He is anointed as king. So he starts off that time as being overlooked and uninvited to that gathering. But David didn't let the opinions of people define his next steps because he was anointed king and he let God's promise dictate those next steps. And so as the story of David and Goliath, as Goliath was threatening the Israelites and none of the other warriors wanted to stand up, David said, no one gets to defy the armies of the Lord. And so he stepped into that space and showed great courage and trust in God to defeat Goliath. And then he becomes a very valuable person to King Saul. So he's in the palace. He kind of becomes like his right-hand man. Maybe we could argue, maybe he came a little too valuable because Saul became jealous of him and the praise that he received from the people. So Saul tried to kill David. David goes on the run. We know that he was on the run for about 12 years. That's a long time. And talked about hope deferred, that God had promised him to be anointed king, and yet it just didn't look like it was going that way, right? If you're David, you think, I don't get it, right? It doesn't seem, God's promises don't seem to be playing out the way I thought they would. And in that time, he has an opportunity because he's battling with King Saul. He has an opportunity to kill Saul, which we would think, yes, you can end this. You're on the run now. You can go back. He chose not to. He recognized that God had anointed him as king, and he wasn't going to force his plan. He was going to wait for God. And so he doesn't. He seeks reconciliation. Still, the run happens, right? Still, Saul is after him. We watch him lose his mentor, Samuel. And the grief of that, of the person who poured into him, the person who anointed him and believed in him. And that season of grief, we watch him be someone that's hard to be around. And then we move to the story of when he becomes king. Right now he's king of Israel, and we watch him with kindness and loyalty with the way that he treated King Saul's family. Because it would have been culture for you to kill the king's family that was there before you. And David didn't. He showed kindness, and we watched that happen. He kept a promise to Saul that Saul asked him to keep when Saul was trying to kill him, and David still kept that promise, right? So we watch David, and we admire him. And then we move into the story of Bathsheba, where David, there was a battle that was happening. He got a little comfortable being king, right? He sent the men out to the battle, and he stayed home when where he should have been was out fighting. And in that time, had temptation, and he saw Bathsheba, and he summoned her to come have sex with him. And we recognize there's a king of great power who has summoned a girl that didn't have the option of saying no, and we see the evil in that. She gets pregnant, which then creates a more problem. So David works to have her husband come back from battle so that they can be together, so that it will come off as his child. Her husband is too loyal for that and will not go spend time with his wife because he stays at the palace. And so David's in trouble. So David arranges for his death and kills him. And this is where we pick up the story. The end of that, he was confronted with what he had done. What we also see about David is in that moment, he had great remorse and cried out to the Lord for mercy and forgiveness. And so we watch God give that to him. And then God says, David, no, that there is a ripple effect to your decisions. There are consequences that are coming because of the way you have led your family. And so coming is trouble and suffering in the arena of your family. And this makes sense to us, right? Because we all recognize that our family unit has a lot of influence over us. Even as an adult today, right, I recognize how my family system has shaped me. There is goodness in that, and there are things in that I've had to unlearn, right? There are sometimes I say things and I think, that is my mother, right? So we see that. And so God speaks that. He warns David that it is coming. And this is where we pick it up. So I think David sits in this space, right, of darkness. He sits in a space of self-doubt and probably self-disappointment, being disappointed with himself. And I think he would say, how did I get here? I was anointed king. I saw this going differently. I saw my life playing out differently. And now I am in a mess that I created, and I can't believe I ever made these choices. And he sits there, right? And then the ripple effect happens, and that's where we're going to pick it up today in the story. We're going to look at 2 Samuel 13, 1 through 2. And it says, now David's son Absalom had a beautiful sister named Tamar, and Amnon, her half-brother, fell desperately in love with her. Amnon became so obsessed with Tamar that he became ill. She was a virgin, and Amnon thought he could never have her. So we see here that one sibling, right? The Absalom and Tamar are probably full siblings, where Amnon is a half-sibling, that he loves, fallen in love with his sister and wants her. So he feels sick. He was kind of down, and one of his cousins noticed this, so his cousin asks him what's going on, and he tells them, and then his cousin says, well, here's a plan. So he developed a plan, a scheme of how he could get Tamar in his bedroom. And so they work that deal. They work that plan. He said, pretend like you're really sick. And then when your dad, King David, comes to you and asks how you are doing, tell him what you need is Tamar asked that Tamar would bring you food and cook it for you so you could feel better. So this is the scheme, right? So when the king asked Tamar to go, you go, right? So she went prepared to cook this food for him. She is making it, and we're going to pick it up here in 2 Samuel 13, verses 11 through 17. But as she was feeding him, he grabbed her and demanded, come to bed with me, my darling sister. No, my brother, she cried, don't be foolish. Don't do this to me. Such a wicked things aren't done in Israel. Where could I go in my shame? And you would be called one of the greatest fools in Israel. Please just speak to the king about it, and he will let you marry me. But Amnon wouldn't listen to her, and since he was stronger than she was, he raped her. Then suddenly Amnon's love turned to hate, and he hated her even more than he had loved her. Get out of here, he snarled at her. No, no, Tamar cried. Sending me away now is worse than what you have already done to me. But Amnon wouldn't listen to her. He shouted for his servant and demanded, throw this woman out and lock the door behind her. So she pleads with him right after it and says, no, because if it becomes public, you get your servants involved. The shame that comes with me is a lifetime, right? She has the trauma of that moment, but also being unprotected of what it means to be a woman and to have that shame for a lifetime. And this is what's happening in the household of David. And so Absalom, who is her brother, is angry. Rightfully so, right? We would all say, of course he is. David finds out, David gets angry, but what we see is David really lacks any kind of action. Some scholars say it's probably because Absalom was his first son. Some scholars say maybe it was because of David's own choices and he had a hard time bringing judgment on someone else because of the decisions and what he had done. But what we know is he really lacks to move much. There's not much discipline there. And then Absalom just gets angry and angry. So time goes by, nothing is done. Absalom creates a scheme to kill his brother in which he does. Then he has to flee because he can't be there anymore because he just killed his brother. So he flees away. And then after that, eventually there's some time goes by, and one of King David's right-hand man, Joab, came to him and recognized how much sorrow he had of losing his son. Because you can imagine David, right in this time, has had a lot of violence in his family and is in very hard space. And so he asks, Joab brokers this deal, and there's this reconciliation that happens, and Absalom is allowed to come back to Jerusalem, and it feels like this beautiful moment, right, of forgiveness. In that, David allows him to come back but will not see him, which you can imagine made Absalom even more angry, because I imagine he feels justified in his actions. Right? There's some justice that he feels like he's standing on, and that his dad is punishing him for no reason when he didn't really punish his brother when his brother acted heinously. So you can imagine, right? There's a lot going on in that family at that time. And so then Absalom is still angry because he can't see his dad and all that goes with that. He stages a coup and stages a rebellion against David. David finds himself on the run again from his son. This time he's on the run because his son is coming after him to kill him. And in this season of being on the run, at one point, Absalom is killed by David's men. And David sits in a space of now losing sons and violence, right? He's had a lot of violence, and he has lost sons to that and the turmoil of that. So you can imagine the heartbreak. And then we find him heartbroken, and his commander of chief, Joab, comes to him and kind of gives him a little what for and says, how can you be so angry? You're acting like we did something wrong. We saved your life. And so he convinces David to go back to Jerusalem, and then David is king again in Jerusalem. But now he is king in this season with great loss, great sorrow, great suffering. And don't you imagine he's thinking, I didn't see it going like this. This is not how this was supposed to be. So in those times, towards the very end of his life, one of his other sons tries to become king. David is able to stop that and then anoints Solomon, who is one of the sons of Bathsheba, to be the next king of Israel. And then in his last moments, he has some time to pass on this blessing to the new king, Solomon. And here's what he says. We're going to pick this up in 1 Kings 2:3-4. And he says, observe the requirements of the Lord your God and follow all his ways. Keep the decrees, commands, regulations, and laws written in the law of Moses so that you will be successful in all you do wherever you go. If you do this, then the Lord will keep the promises he made to me. He told me, if your descendants live as they should and follow me faithfully with all their heart and soul, one of them will always sit on the throne of Israel. So, I'll be honest. When I first read that, there's a part of me that thought, David, you probably should have listened to those instructions, right? You're like, maybe you want to do that a little better, which then I'm like, well, it's a little judgy. Right, number one. Number two is if I'm King David at this moment, I get it, right? He's probably with confidence saying to King Solomon, don't do what I did. I have lived in the pain and the sorrow of the consequences of my choices. I don't want that for you. I want better for you. So in this last time, as he gives these words, this blessing and this instruction as he gives to King Solomon, so I get it, right? But you know what? It leaves us to wrestle with, challenges us and leaves us to wrestle with a description that God gave King David. He said to King David, you are a man after my own heart. The only person in Scripture God gives that description to. And if I'm looking at it, right, I look at King David's life, his whole life, and I think, God, did you miss it? Right? Did you see everything? Because this is what's true about King David. Yes, he had heroic acts, right? He did heroic things, but he also did horrific evil in his life. And so the question is, how can what does it mean to be a person after God's own heart when we look at all the goodness they did, but also the evil? Are they good? Are they bad? And it leaves us to question that. what does it mean to be a person after God's own heart if that's the description he gave David? I think really to answer that question, we have to ask another question. And that is this: what does it mean to be a follower of Christ? Because I think oftentimes for us, what that means or what we think that means is about our behavior. Being a Christian means I do these things, I don't do these things, and that makes me a Christian. There is even this study it's probably been 5 or 6 years ago, that was done on teenagers, about teenagers who grew up in church, who are an active part of the youth ministry. And what they did is they studied them from the time they were a student to going off into the next stage of life, whether that was college or whatever that was. And what they found was 50% of them fell away from their faith. Which, for us who have spent time in youth ministry, what we say is, yep, right? Like that matches our experience. It's not a stat we like. It's one that really is heartbreaking, truthfully. But one of the questions, which I thought was so telling, that they asked these people, these students who walked away from their faith as they journey with them for a number of years, they asked them, what does it mean to be a Christian? Which if I grew up in church, right? I was an active youth minister or youth ministry student. I should be able, right? You're like, I want them to be equipped to answer this question. But what they found was that most of the students, when they answered that question, answered it with some kind of behavior. What does it mean to be a Christian? It means to pray. It means to serve others. It means to go to church. It means to do all these things. But here's the problem. If being a Christ follower is about what I do, what happens when I mess it up? And I don't mean mess it up like I overslept in my alarm and missed school or work. I mean, when you really mess it up, what happens if the center of your faith is you and your behavior? It means probably you pack it up and say, I can't do this. I don't have what it takes to be a Christian because obviously look what I just did. Christianity, Christ, being a Christ follower, has never and will never be about what we do or what we don't do. The core of our faith is not about what we do, but is about what has been done for us. And grateful, right? What we recognize is that we stand in need of a Savior. Because if I'm the center of my faith, I'm in trouble. Because I know me, right? You're like, and I look, if what is good is, if the measurement of good is Jesus, which I believe it is, then I look at me and I look at good and I think, nope, right? I don't measure up to that. And that is why Jesus came. He came because he said, you are in need of a Savior, so I am coming. Not because you can do it in and of yourself, because you need me. And if we put ourselves, or we put our behavior in the center of our faith, then what we are also saying is, I don't need the cross. And that is not a space we want to be in, right? That's not a space I would ever say, but sometimes when I define my faith as my behavior, that is what I am saying. And aren't we grateful that there's a God who says, I know you deeply, and I deem you worthy. Not because of what you do or what you don't do, not because of your accomplishments or your failures, but because of whose you are, and that is mine. God gets to say, you are mine, you have value, despite anything else, what you do or don't do, what you accomplish, what you don't accomplish, where you failed or where you have succeeded. None of that gets to define your value. And if that is where we land, right, if we can land in that space, then what would it look like if we said, just here, the people here and also online, if we said, I'm going to be intentional about showing people value outside of their decisions or their status. Our community would be different, right? What if we said, I'm going to be intentional about sharing that you don't have to be good enough because Jesus has been good enough on your behalf. And what if we said, I'm going to be intentional about living in the space that my worth is not defined by anything or anyone but Jesus. Those are powerful spaces. And here's what I will say to us. Our world, our community, St. Pete, doesn't need us to be sharing our faith about what you do or don't do. What they need us to lead with is that you are someone of value, you are someone who is loved, period. And when we get that right, it changes us. When I understand that there's a God who understood I needed rescued and initiated a rescue mission for me, it changes me and it changes my heart and how I respond. It doesn't mean I'm always going to get it right? But it means that I'm going to have that center and I'm going to know who I am. And when I get it wrong, I'm going to have truth to come back to. And I think as we look about what does it mean to be a person after God's own heart, it must not mean behavior, because that wouldn't be David. What it means, I think, is that someone who moves towards God, right? After God's heart, this movement of moving toward God. And here's what's true. There are times in David's life where he was moving towards God in a great way, right? He did heroic things. And then there was moments when he wandered and he got lost and he made some horrific decisions. And then what I love about that is then David said, right? He didn't stay there. He then moved back. We read the Psalms and what we hear David saying, right, is crying out to God and always praising God and moving back to God even when he has stepped over here. There's a hymn that I love called "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing." And one of the lines in it says, Lord, I'm prone to wonder. I feel it. I'm prone to wonder. Isn't that the truth? But God, in your wondering, is not, he's not surprised by that. In the times when we wonder, what he is saying is, come to me because here I am. And so that we get to wonder, we get to do that, and then we get to come back. And I think for myself, there are times that gets complicated for me. There are times when I have wandered and I have gotten lost. And oftentimes for me, that means there has been something that has caused me to be disappointed in myself. That it is really easy for me to sit there. And I don't really want to engage in those feelings because that's not fun, right? Who really wants to engage in the feelings of being disappointed with yourself? And so I just stay here. And here's what also I need to do, because I don't want to engage in those feelings or have to work through that. I've got to be able to find some ways to escape, avoid my feelings. And for me, oftentimes, particularly in this season, that means binge watching TV, right? What season can I get involved in? How can I get a part of someone else's story so I don't have to think about my own? And then I look at David and I admire him because he went from lost to just moving here. And I recognize I sit and flounder here. And then what does it mean, right? To step back. And we can do that when we recognize that there is a God who loves us. There is a God who is always saying, come to me. So as we look at David's life, right, we hold what is good. We hold the heroic. We hold the horrific evil. And we say, both is who David is. He's not one, he's not the other. And that's challenging for us because let's be real, I don't like to be labeled, but I like to label. Right? And so if I can label things, it makes it simple. It makes me in control, which makes me feel safe and secure, and I love those things. And so it's easy, right, when I see people's actions, if I